Welcome to the Digital Insight Podcast, where today I'm exploring the electric vehicle market, and I ask the question, is it as advanced and as mature as it should be? Joining me to try and answer this is Paul Loustalan, a partner at Reddie Grose, a global provider of patents, trademarks and designs. Okay, so Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
So before we sort of dive into our topic of discussion today, which is obviously going to be look at the sort of the EV market and I suppose looking at the question as to why it's perhaps not as advanced and as mature as it should be, I'd like to start by asking all guests to give us a bit of an introduction as to who you are, mostly from, well, obviously for me, of course, mostly for our listeners and our viewers to sort of find out a little bit about who you are, what your experience is, and what kind of perspective you have on that EV and automotive sector kind of landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a UK and European patent attorney, but that means I've got a technical background as well. So I trained as a mechanical engineer as my first degree, and I've actually got a PhD in the automotive world, which sort of slightly unfortunately for me was in internal combustion engines, which we seem to be moving rapidly away from. And so I'm moving myself away from that as well. So, I mean, that was 20 years ago or so now. And I've been working as a patent attorney for the last 15 years or something, and slowly moving from that sort of what you might consider to be the old school internal combustion engines more to the new school sort of electric vehicle world. So slowly working with more and more clients in that electric vehicle world over the last, as I say, sort of particularly over the last 5 years, but certainly over the last 10. Really enjoying working with that new.
Carry on.
Sorry, really enjoying working with the new tech. Really, it feels like the beginning of another phase of the automotive world.
No, fantastic. And so you said there then a very interesting part. It's a very exciting time, like you say, for electric vehicles for the automotive world. But you, of course, over those years, like you said, it's perhaps been the last 5 years, but even going back to your degree, you've been looking at automotives, you've been sort of working around that space. EVs and electric vehicles and sort of the advancements in technology around the automotive sector have always been sort of big news. They've always been kind of disruptive technologies. We're always hearing about what the next stage of that's going to be. As best as possible, looking over the last 5 to 10 years, from what you've seen, from your perspective, from that patents perspective, what have kind of been some of the perhaps more recent, of course, the bigger shifts and the bigger trends in terms of just what are you seeing? What are you seeing in terms of behaviors, in terms of what people are asking for, what people are looking to kind of develop? Like, just give me a bit of an overview as to that.
I guess it feels like there's been quite a big shift over certainly the last 10 years, but even the last 5 or 2 or 3. There's, as I say, it feels like that new wave of automotive companies, and as it was perhaps at the beginning of the 20th century when you had vast numbers of small car manufacturers producing small volumes of vehicles, and then slowly they were weeded out until at the end of last century we had sort of the top 5 massive car makers and not really anybody else. And it feels like we've now got lots of small companies building up, lots of startups challenging those existing OEMs, and you can see that in the patent filings as well. The existing OEMs are still filing lots of patent applications to everything they're doing, but you can see that the smaller players are building up their portfolios as well, therefore spending lots of R&D investment in working out where they're going next and trying to be, I guess, those next big players in the automotive world. That feels like the biggest trend over the last 5 years. And so we've been helping some of those smaller companies, some of the startups to really build up their portfolio of patents in the whole sort of almost the whole gamut of the automotive world, but certainly it feels like those sort of key pain points of energy density. So, what do your batteries look like? What does the storage look like? How do we get the price down? But also sort of more at the control end and at the electric motor end as well, because that also helps. Clearly, if your motors are more efficient and more power dense, then that helps you keep your mass down, which increases the range and means your batteries don't need to be quite so good. And so there's definitely development there as well. I guess what we've seen is that the car makers are still developing their internal combustion engines as well. They are definitely not the past. They are still the present and will be the future as well. And the number of patent filings for internal combustion engines is still going up. There is still demand there. There's still more and more being filed each year compared to the previous year. But a few years ago, I think about 4 years ago, the number of patent filings to electric vehicle technology was exceeded the number of filings for internal combustion engines. So, electric vehicles with power on board, i.e., not trains, basically, exceeded the number of patent filings in the IC engine world. And are continuing to accelerate at pace. And I think that sort of speaks to the point I was making just now about those smaller companies filing more and more. If you've got lots of small companies filing lots of patents, then clearly you're going to have lots overall. Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, and yeah, no, it sounds fascinating, and particularly, I'll hold my hands up and say it's. In terms of obviously patents, in terms of that side of that whole process, it's something that we don't hear about. We just sort of hear and read about, government mandates for electronic vehicles by such and such year, or the big companies have to start playing ball and doing this, but we don't actually sort of see the day-to-day, the kind of how it even started, the very start of those processes. Something you flagged there, or you raised there, was it kind of lends itself to different conversations that I have where just flip to look at a different industry and kind of compare. So I talk a lot to sort of fintech companies and insurance companies about how they are now, obviously, the insurance model is adapting, and how for many a great year, it's been a model that's always worked. It's always happened a certain way. So the big players have dominated those markets because they're successful. They control how it works. And then in the last sort of, I can't put a number on it, but obviously a couple of decades, smaller startups have truly disrupted that space. And now the incumbents, those bigger companies, are having to almost find themselves not necessarily on the back foot, but they're now having to pay more attention to these smaller startups. Whereas once before they could have just dismissed them as, that's great for them, but it doesn't affect us. It doesn't affect our operations. Looking at then, as you said about OEMs, looking at vehicle manufacturers, how is that market dynamic shifting then? Are they now starting to look at the smaller startups? Because those smaller startups, those disruptors, are actually bringing about real change. Give me a bit of an idea as to what that dynamic looks like, and if it could shift, if it could be a point where they're never going to impact the capital of the big companies, of course not, but they are going to start impacting them from we need to think differently about how we approach what we do, what we develop, how we roll it out.
Yeah, that's a big question and a great one. I could talk on that all day, I suspect, but I mean, just if we look at Tesla, for example, everyone loves to talk about Tesla in the EV world. They are clearly a disruptor. 10 years ago, they were a couple of weeks away from complete bankruptcy and failure. Now they're the most valuable car company in the world because they are indeed a disruptor. They went their own route, and they've gone their own route in terms of protecting their intellectual property as well. They've sort of this pledge by Elon Musk not to enforce their IP against anyone as long as those people also give them a free license to use their tech. They're disruptive in kind of every way, and I think that is forcing the hand of the OEMs to move as quickly as they can. But I think, unfortunately, for the OEMs, it's quite difficult for them to move quickly. They're big beasts, and moving to operate in the as a disruptor disrupting their own markets is not a great thing, because that's where they get their revenue from. And I'm not sure there's the overall demand in the marketplace even for them to move that quickly. But yeah, the smaller companies, and Tesla is just one example of a small company, or at least it was 10 years ago, that are forcing the hand, I think, of the OEMs to move really quickly, or move at least as quickly as they can. And there are other examples especially coming out of China. There are vast numbers of electric vehicle manufacturers coming up in China, and it's a big market in of itself, and most of them are actually purely local within China. But some will expand out, and some will come into the rest of the world, and again disrupt those big OEMs. And I think what helps them. Sorry, I think I was going to say what helps them is that the electric vehicle market technology is actually much more straightforward in some ways to get into than a sort of complex internal combustion engine type vehicle. And so those hurdles to entry are much lower. And so yeah, those disruptors can come in. They've got lots of capital because people are investing in them. The OEMs, who are surviving on sort of razor thin margins from their existing businesses, I think are finding it quite difficult to both get their EVs on the market and get people to buy them, and without sort of running out of cash along the way. Yeah, really interesting. I hope that answers your question.
And yeah, of course it did. And it's, we'll talk we'll zoom out a little bit then and just look at EVs in general and the whole conversation around them. Sorry. And this isn't the first time anyone's talked about them. This isn't going to be the last time anyone's talked about them. And I feel like we've been talking about electric vehicles for quite a while. I remember a few years ago now having to kind of speak to somebody and talk about well, where are we then? And that was approaching 5 years ago now. My partner works in the automotive sector. I hear about her and what they're doing with, in terms of how they're selling and producing and marketing EVs, and obviously that's increased. And it always feels like, much like any technology, I don't want to say it's just a buzzword, because we know it exists. We know there's actual physical, real, tangible successes and things we can point to where it has its place. However, it always feels like it's just out of reach. It always feels like, the EV market is going to land. It's going to be great in the near future. It's just over the horizon. And I feel like we've been sort of saying that for years. And I know there are many parts to why that is. But, broadly speaking, we sit here in 2021. For many, they would have thought they've already been driving EVs. Why or where are we then? How far away are we, as best as possible from it being such a common thing, as opposed to just this luxury, lucrative, almost sci-fi technology that's just out of reach?
I think I'm obviously not going to be able to answer that question, but but I think if we look at, for example, one of the big factors is cost. Clearly, before electric vehicles become mainstream, they need to get at least close to the cost of a normal vehicle and not a luxury vehicle. It's quite easy at the luxury end to replace your high-end Mercedes with a Tesla, because the prices are comparable. But when you get down to the sort of Ford Focus level, it becomes much more difficult for manufacturers to produce the EVs at that level. And a lot of that is to do with the battery price. And if you look at the sort of the price per kilowatt hour, 10 years ago, it was well over $1,000. At the moment, I think it's close to 100. And I think that $100 per kilowatt hour has always been spoken about as the tipping point where you can just about start to produce EVs. with a reasonable range at the sort of normal price level for a vehicle. And you've sort of seen that with the Tesla Model 3, the sort of entry level. It's getting towards the price of a normal similar comparable IC engine vehicle. So that's one point. So the price is clearly a massive driving factor, and without getting that price down, they're simply not going to become mainstream. I think there is also that infrastructure side of people are concerned that, well, if I buy this electric vehicle, how on earth am I going to charge the thing up? I don't have a driveway to put my car on. How am I going to charge it overnight? Which means I need to go and either trail a cable across the pavement, and that's not ideal, or I need to go and fast charge it somewhere. What's that going to do to the life of the battery? How much is that going to cost me? How long is it going to take? So I think that infrastructure side is also a bit of a break on take up. And then there's the classic range anxiety of people who actually want to drive to see Granny down in Cornwall and see that 300-mile journey or whatever it might be as a massive factor. And if they have to stop halfway through and charge their vehicle up for an hour, then they're probably going to say, well, actually, an EV isn't for me. When in reality, 99% of their life is spent doing less than 40 miles a day, where an EV is perfectly fine. So I think there are lots and lots of factors there, and I think that tipping point, as you say, will only occur when you get all of those things coming together. That people realise that, well, range anxiety isn't really a thing, because you should have a break when you're driving anyway. And fast chargers now, in half an hour, you could easily get enough power into your vehicle to carry on and do the rest of your journey. As I say, hopefully price is coming down, and infrastructure is building up massively and quickly. Fast chargers are popping up all over the place. People are starting to install chargers in lampposts on the street. I think I feel like the tipping point is coming. All of the OEMs have got electric vehicles out on the market now. It feels like it's becoming more mainstream, and I think as the battery tech improves, and we can see that with the price coming down and energy density going up, I feel like the tipping point might be soon, especially when you then add in governments basically enforcing electric vehicles to keep emissions down. So let's hope it isn't sort of fusion that is always 30 years in the future. Let's hope it's okay, this is going to happen now, because clearly from an emissions point of view, it needs to. Although that's a whole other question as to where the emissions might go and how clean electric vehicles actually are if you look at the life cycle. But maybe we won't go there.
But that does we'll not obviously pick apart how clean are they, or we'll tell let's deconstruct an entire electric vehicle and look at how it might not be better, or it might be better. But you mentioned range anxiety, so we're talking about the drivers themselves, the customers, the you and me, people on the street who will be buying these, homeowners who will have these cars. They're going to replace their current vehicles. It's a question that I ask everyone, and obviously everyone has a different answer, and you might not even have the perfect answer, of course, but obviously there's, like you say, there's price, there's infrastructure, there's government mandates. So they're sort of the three big drivers of that change. But then obviously the big thing is the customer. There's going to be people who want to, and so when a manufacturer, when an OEM is considering, I'm trying to think of the right way to word this, just how much do they also factor in what the customers want? It's all right saying this is better for the environment, this is what is needed by the government, this is cost effective. If a consumer doesn't want it, and if and I'm sure that of course we do, but if a large consumer base doesn't want it, how do they kind of tackle that challenge of, well, I prefer the car that I have, I don't need to sort of invest in this new technology? Like, it's that age old problem of you can't just turn your back on it's not as black and white, sorry, as seeing it as, well, this customer prefers the technology of today, this customer prefers the technology of yesterday. Like, how does that even conversation happen around catering to both types of customer?
And I suspect the market's general people's reluctance to change, not willingness to change. The reluctance to change is why we're seeing a bit of a drop off on the rate of increase of EVs as a proportion of vehicles sold. I think we're still only at sort of worldwide a few percent, 2 or 3% of new vehicles sold are EVs. A lot of that is being driven by China, and for whatever reason, the proportion of new EVs in China is dropping off as a proportion of the vehicles sold. I feel like we might have hit that point where the early adopters have got there. There'll now be a bit of a hiatus as the technology develops a bit. And once the technology is developed sufficiently that basically you're not really going to notice the difference, it's just another powertrain, and as soon as you get to the point where most consumers can't actually tell the difference what they're driving, it's just a bit quieter in terms of refueling. At the end of the month, they realise that it's been a bit cheaper. I think that's when you'll get that tipping point. But you're right, until you get there, selling it to the mainstream is really difficult, because why would you change away from your diesel, your petrol, where you just sort of, you're into your routine, you go and fill it up once a week and you drive it around and you forget about it. I think there's a big task for the OEMs in particular, I would think, to selling electric vehicles and teaching the mainstream what these things are and how actually you might need to use them slightly differently. You're recharging overnight if possible. You're not filling it up once a week. Look, actually, in reality, you're doing 40 miles a day. You're doing 20 miles to work and back. You don't need 300 miles range in your vehicle. This one that does 200 miles is perfectly fine for you. There's education there as well. And maybe the OEMs can do that on their own. I don't know. Maybe government's stepping in and forcing OEMs' hand. But that doesn't really change the way people are thinking and what they want. Yeah. It's a difficult one. Because as I say, the OEMs, they make their money from selling things. They don't make their money from forcing new technology on people.
And on one thing that with any technology will always help sway that conversation, but also is success stories. So you said at the start, Tesla's the big story. Everyone thinks EVs. They think, aren't Tesla doing that? They're kind of the big name driving that kind of conversation. But obviously, in recent years, we've seen Google successfully, trial and roll out and show off their EV technology, and even, like you say, Ford's or other bigger companies. So obviously the success is there, seeing them and saying, like, yeah, it successfully drove out. You see them on the street, people who've got them. Naturally, they will propel the market forward. That will propel that conversation. That will, we're at that tipping point. That's going to be key to pushing it over the edge to, that becoming a bit more commonplace. However, and this comes with everything, when the tech doesn't work, when things just don't quite work out, when we suffer these missteps and failures, for lack of a better word, that can also have such a really bad impact on that market and that drive. But I always like to ask, how important is it to actually focus more on where they've gone wrong than to focus on, this is how great it is, because you can learn more, you can educate more, as we've just been talking about the technology because of what's gone wrong. Like, so basically, don't ignore the failures and the mistakes. Let's almost focus on them equally, or if not more than the successes, because that's going to be key to pushing us further down that conversation.
Clear. I mean, learning from others' mistakes is always a great way to learn, isn't it? I mean, if you can do that rather than learning from your own, then fantastic. a difficult question. I guess there's we don't always see all of those failures, obviously, because some companies will just never emerge into the light of day. They sort of fail before they've even met the first hurdle. But yeah, there's clearly, as I say, I think there are lots of companies out there all trying to get into this place, and there will be lots failing as well, because there probably isn't room for all of them. We've seen companies try to emerge out of China into the rest of the world, and just haven't managed it for one reason or another. Haven't managed to get the funding. The technology isn't quite there. They've run into manufacturing issues, particularly in the automotive world. Those manufacturing issues are enormous, which is where the OEMs clearly have a massive advantage. Even Tesla, with all of their money, have found manufacturing ridiculously difficult. So I think learning from those mistakes and learning from the industry as a whole, in that sense of how you actually get a vehicle to market for a reasonable price at a reasonable quality. But yeah, in terms of technology failures, I think bringing it back to my domain, as it were, on patents, we see vast numbers of patent applications to technology that will never see the light of day, because that's kind of the way the patent system works. You have to file before it's public, which means invariably you're filing your patent applications before that technology is matured, and certainly before it's on the market, to see whether people like it or not. So even looking at the patent applications that have been filed to work out, okay, we can see that particular area is taken off, it probably means that there's some gold there, as it were. We need to go and dig and find it. So using that as a source of potential sort of dead ends not to follow. Okay, there's no one's filing patent applications in that area anymore. It's probably a good reason for us not to go and explore. Again, a difficult one, but an important one for companies to look at, learn from others' mistakes in their own.
And my final question for you then, and I'm not asking you to predict the future, of course not. You might not even be able to predict next week. That's just the way these things roll. But you said, you see from the patent perspective, you see trends, you see what the smaller startups are looking to kind of put out there. You're seeing those developments at a smaller scale. More. You have a particular insight that perhaps no one else has or would even consider. So what do you think, like looking then over as best as possible, the next year, you said we're at a tipping point and there are a lot of things that need to align and to be working together for it to really crack on. But just sort of from what you see, what do you think kind of is the next shift, the next kind of key moment in EV sort of development, in terms of how it could be a huge thing, it could be just a small thing that's going to start to just push that needle further?
Well, I mentioned it earlier, and that price for the batteries, which is the major cost in any electric vehicle, that will continue to come down, even though the capacity of the batteries is going up. I think it won't be a tipping point, but it will clearly be a big driver of that more sort of mainstream adoption. But I do wonder whether, and this is all sort of talking about lithium-ion batteries, I kind of expect lithium-ion not to be the future, and it won't be the next year. But people are starting to get towards manufacturing solid-state batteries, which are much more power dense and much cheaper all at the same time. And once they start becoming more mainstream, or indeed mainstream at all, on the market, I think that will make a major difference to electric vehicles and their take up, because then they genuinely will be comparable to just your common garden car that you see on the street every day. I can't see it happening in a year, though. I can't see. I think more like 5 years feels like we could feel like a major step from where we are now. especially because of the UK government and other governments around the world moving to ban the sale of diesel and petrol cars. I think it's inevitable. You can't keep investing in those petrol and diesel cars if you can't sell them. So there will be more and more of the balance of R&D moving to electric vehicles as opposed to internal combustion engine vehicles.
Perfect. And this is a quick question while I have you, just out of interest. But obviously, I'm always, and you might even have an answer. But I'm always curious because obviously, there are governments are setting timelines. Governments are setting deadlines, for lack of a better word, for when they want to. They want to see more EV rollouts. They want to see a move away from kind of diesel combustion engines and whatnot. But I'm always curious, what happens when we get to those dates and we can't deliver on those promises? Like, is it just a case of, oh well, we'll just move the date a few more years, or like? I'm always curious. Because the kind of trends suggest that we're going to get there, it's going to happen. But it's just I'm always curious as like, but what if it didn't? Then what happens? Like, is that going to knock the market back? Is that going to sort of cause a huge crash? Like, I'm very curious to see what would happen in those what if scenarios.
No, I don't think. I hope the UK government consulted industry, and I'm sure they did, in terms of whether 2030, did they move it forward to, was feasible or not. What I suspect will happen is that there'll be some sort of slight changes around the edges in terms of, well, what do we really mean by a ban of internal combustion engine new sales? What about plug-in hybrids? And that will run on a bit longer. So I think they've left themselves enough room around the edges that there won't be that crash of suddenly, oh well, no one can buy a car because no one's launched a vehicle at a decent price point that enables that to actually occur. There's always a bit of wiggle room somewhere. I would hope that there isn't that hard line that means that, well, suddenly nobody can buy a new car. You might think the resale value of vehicles might go up, by the way, as people not wanting to move to that new tech, but we'll see what happens.